January 2014. The diagnosis room at New York Presbyterian Hospital carried that specific kind of silence that changes lives forever. David Bowie sat perfectly still, his fingers interlaced on his lap, while Iman gripped the armrest of her chair so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Dr. Richard Chen had delivered terminal diagnoses before, hundreds of them across his 30-year career. But something about this particular morning felt different. The man sitting across from him wasn't just a patient. He was an icon who had spent 5 decades transforming himself into countless personas, and now Chen had to tell him that time itself had run out. The scans were unambiguous. Stage 4 liver cancer, metastasized, aggressive. Chen had reviewed them 3 times with his colleagues before this appointment, hoping someone would find an error, a shadow that wasn't really there, a reason to deliver different news. But the images told the same story every time. He looked at Bowie, then at Iman, and began speaking the words he'd rehearsed in his mind since dawn. 6 months, maybe 12 if they started aggressive treatment immediately. The cancer had spread too far for surgery. Chemotherapy might buy some time, but the quality of that time would be compromised. Chen explained the options methodically, professionally, the way he'd been trained. But his voice carried the weight of what these words actually meant. The end of David Bowie. The end of an era. The end of a man who had seemed, to the world, somehow immune to the ordinary rules of mortality. What happened next would haunt Dr. Chen for the rest of his life. Not because it was tragic, but because it was so utterly unexpected that it redefined everything he thought he understood about how people face death. Iman's sob broke the silence first. Her hand flew to her mouth as tears began streaming down her face. She turned to her husband, expecting to see the same devastation reflected back, expecting to catch him as he fell apart. But David Bowie did something that nobody in that room could have predicted. He smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a smile of denial or shock. A genuine, almost peaceful smile that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep and settled within him. Dr. Chen stopped mid-sentence, his carefully prepared speech about treatment options dying on his lips. In 3 decades of delivering terminal diagnoses, he had seen every reaction imaginable. Rage, denial, bargaining, immediate grief, stoic acceptance, even the occasional laugh born from pure psychological defense. But this serene smile from a man who had just been told he had months to live? Chen actually leaned back in his chair, momentarily forgetting his professional composure. Iman's voice came out as barely a whisper, choked with tears and confusion. David, there was a lifetime of questions in that single word. How can you smile? How are you not screaming? How is this happening? But Bowie stood up slowly, deliberately, as if he'd just received good news instead of a death sentence. He extended his hand to Dr. Chen with genuine warmth. Thank you, doctor. Truly, you've given me something I've needed for 50 years. Chen shook his hand automatically, his mind racing to understand what he was witnessing. Mr. Bowie, I'm not sure you fully understand. The prognosis is... I understand perfectly, Bowie interrupted gently. You've given me a deadline, an actual definite endpoint. Do you know how rare that is? Most people live their entire lives not knowing when it ends. They waste years, decades, thinking there's always more time. But me? I know. 6 months, 12 months. It's a gift. The room fell into a profound silence. Outside, the sounds of Manhattan filtered through the window. Car horns, distant sirens, the ordinary chaos of a city that had no idea what was unfolding in this sterile room on the 8th floor. Iman was staring at her husband, as if seeing him for the first time, tears still flowing, but her expression shifting from grief to something else. Confusion, awe, a kind of terrified admiration. Dr. Chen would later tell his wife that night, breaking his usual policy of never discussing patients at home, that he felt like he was watching someone unlock a door that most humans don't even know exists. It was like he'd been waiting for this news his entire life, Chen said. Like everything before was preparation for this moment. Bowie turned to Iman, taking both her hands in his. His own eyes were wet now, but his voice remained steady. My love, listen to me. For 50 years I've been running. From David Jones. From myself. I became Ziggy because I was terrified of being ordinary. I became the thin white duke because Ziggy consumed me. I became everyone except the person I started as. Every album, every character, every transformation was me fleeing from the fact that I didn't know who I was underneath all the masks. He paused, and in that pause, something extraordinary happened. The machines in the room seemed to quiet. The traffic noise faded. Even Iman's breathing steadied. It was as if the universe itself was leaning in to listen. But now I have 6 months, maybe 12, and I finally know what I have to do. I have to create one last thing. Not as Ziggy, not as any character. As David Robert Jones, the boy from Brixton who loved music and dreamed of the stars. I'm going to make an album that's actually me. No hiding. No personas. Just the truth of who I am and what it means to die. And then, when it's finished, I'm going to die as myself. Not as a rock star. As a man. Before leaving Dr. Chen's office that January morning, Bowie asked one more question that would later seem prophetic. Doctor, will I have enough strength to work? To record? To create? Chen, still processing everything he'd witnessed, replied honestly. For several months, yes. Maybe 6 or 7. After that, the decline will be rapid. Bowie nodded, satisfied. 7 months to make a masterpiece. Mozart composed an entire requiem in less time. Within 48 hours, Bowie had assembled his team. Producer Tony Visconti received a phone call that started with the words, Tony, I need you for one more album, the last one. But nobody can know why it's the last one. Visconti, who had worked with Bowie since the early 70s, heard something in his old friend's voice that made him cancel everything else on his schedule. He flew to New York the next day. The recording sessions for what would become Black Star began in early February 2014 at the Magic Shop and Human Worldwide Studios in New York. Bowie had chosen jazz musicians for this project, players who could improvise and follow him into unknown territory. Drummer Mark Guiliana, saxophonist Donnie McCaslin, and the rest of the ensemble had no idea they were creating a dying man's final testament. They thought they were making an experimental jazz rock album. They had no idea they were witnessing something far more profound. But there was something different about these sessions that everyone noticed, even if they couldn't name it. Bowie worked with an intensity that bordered on possession. He would arrive at the studio early and stay late, sometimes working 12-hour days despite the physical toll it was taking. Visconti noticed that Bowie had lost weight, that his energy would flag by evening, that some days he needed to lie down between takes. But when Bowie was behind the microphone, something else took over. A clarity, a purpose, an absolute determination to get every note, every word, every breath exactly right. He was racing against something, Visconti would say years later, after the truth came out. I thought he was just excited about the new direction. I didn't realize he was racing against death itself. The songs Bowie wrote during those months carried messages that only became clear after his death. But even during the recording, there were moments when the lyrics hit so close to the bone that everyone in the studio felt a chill run through them, even though they didn't understand why. When Bowie first played the demo of the title track for Visconti in March 2014, the producer sat in stunned silence for a full minute after it ended. The song opened with the line, "In the villa of Orman stands a solitary candle," a reference that Visconti later discovered was about a place between life and death in obscure folklore. But it was the chorus that hit hardest, with Bowie's voice crying out in a way that seemed to contain 50 years of searching and fear and finally, acceptance. "Something happened on the day he died," Bowie sang, and Visconti felt his skin prickle. "Tony," he said carefully, "this is about death. Very specifically about death." Bowie looked at him with those mismatched eyes, one pupil permanently dilated from that teenage fight decades ago, and smiled that same peaceful smile he'd given Dr. Chen. "It's about transformation," he replied. "Everything I've ever done has been about transformation. This is just the final one." Throughout 2014 and into 2015, Bowie continued working while telling almost no one about his diagnosis. His children knew. Iman knew. A handful of closest friends and collaborators eventually learned. But the world had no idea. When he made rare public appearances, he looked thinner, perhaps a bit tired, but nothing that suggested he was terminal. He had become so good at wearing masks over the decades that hiding his dying body was just one more performance. But there were moments when the mask slipped, when the reality of what was happening broke through, and those moments nearly destroyed everyone who witnessed them. In June 2015, during a particularly grueling vocal session for the song Lazarus, Bowie suddenly stopped mid-take and walked out of the studio without a word. Visconti followed him into the hallway and found him leaning against the wall, breathing hard, his face gray with pain. "I can't," Bowie whispered. "Tony, I don't think I can finish this." Visconti, still not knowing the full truth about the cancer's progression, felt panic rising in his chest. "David, we can take a break. We can come back tomorrow, next week, whenever you're ready." But Bowie shook his head. "You don't understand. There might not be a tomorrow. There might not be a next week." And then, for just a moment, the facade cracked completely. "I'm dying, Tony. I'm actually dying. And I'm terrified I won't finish this before I go." That was the moment Visconti finally understood everything. The intensity, the long hours, the weight loss, the occasional grimaces of pain that Bowie tried to hide, the way he would sometimes close his eyes between takes as if gathering strength from somewhere deep inside. It all clicked into horrible, clear focus. Visconti put his arm around his friend's shoulders. "Then we finish it, whatever it takes. We finish your masterpiece." They went back into the studio. Bowie nailed the vocal in one take. When it was done, both men were crying. The video confessions. The music videos Bowie created for Black Star contain some of the most haunting imagery he ever produced. And now, knowing what was happening behind the scenes, they play like visual suicide notes, written in symbolic language. Director Johann Renck was brought in to helm the videos for both the title track and Lazarus in late 2015. Bowie was very specific about what he wanted, down to minute details that seemed abstract at the time, but became devastatingly clear after his death. In the Black Star video, Bowie appears as a blind prophet with button eyes, a crucified scarecrow, and finally as himself in a room with a black star on the wall. The imagery of death, transcendence, and cosmic transformation is everywhere. But it was during the filming of Lazarus that things became almost unbearably intense. The video shows Bowie lying in a hospital bed, his eyes bandaged, writing frantically in a notebook. Near the end, he backs into a wardrobe and closes the door on himself, disappearing. It's a visual metaphor so transparent that it's painful to watch now. Rank would later reveal that Bowie was in significant pain during the shoot, that they had to take frequent breaks, that some days it was unclear whether Bowie would have the strength to continue. But every time the camera rolled, Bowie found reserves of energy that seemed to come from pure willpower. He was creating his own eulogy, Rank said, and he was determined to get it right. There's one moment in the Lazarus video that destroys everyone who knows the context. Near the beginning, Bowie sings the line, "Look up here, I'm in heaven," while lying in that bed, and his expression contains such a complex mixture of fear, acceptance, defiance, and peace that it's almost impossible to watch without breaking down. He wasn't acting. He was processing his own death in real time, on camera, and inviting the world to witness it. By late 2015, Bowie's condition had deteriorated significantly. The cancer was winning, as everyone knew it eventually would. He spent more time at home, surrounded by Iman and his children, trying to pack a lifetime of final conversations into the dwindling days he had left. His daughter Alexandria, who everyone called Lexi, was only 15. She knew her father was sick, but like most teenagers, she struggled to comprehend the finality of what was coming. Bowie spent hours with her, talking about everything and nothing, trying to give her enough memories to last a lifetime. He would play piano for her, old songs and new fragments that would never be finished. He would tell her stories about her grandfather, about growing up in Brixton, about the person he was before he became Bowie. One evening in November, Lexi found him in his study, staring at an old photograph. It was from 1973, a shot of Ziggy Stardust in full glory, red hair blazing, platform boots, the iconic lightning bolt makeup. Lexi sat down next to him. "Do you miss it, Dad? Being that?" Bowie was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I miss the energy, the possibility, the feeling that I could be anyone, anything. But no, I don't miss being Ziggy, because Ziggy was a prison I built for myself. A beautiful, glittering prison, but a prison nonetheless. Right now, sitting here with you, dying, I'm more free than I've ever been, because I'm just David, your dad. Not a character, not a performance, just me." Lexi started crying. Bowie held her. Outside the window, New York continued its endless noise and movement, indifferent to the quiet tragedy unfolding in that room. January 8, 2016, Bowie's 69th birthday. After 2 years of secret work, pain, determination, and a race against mortality itself, Black Star was released to the world. The timing was deliberate, precise, meaningful. Bowie wanted his final artistic statement to arrive on the day he was born, creating a perfect circle between beginning and end. The album was met with immediate acclaim. Critics called it adventurous, strange, challenging, brilliant. They analyzed the jazz influences, the experimental production, the cryptic lyrics. They called it a triumphant return to form for an artist who had been relatively quiet for years. They had no idea they were reviewing a man's final words to the world. Bowie spent his birthday at home with Iman and his children. Too weak now to do much more than sit and listen to messages from friends around the world celebrating both the album and his birthday. He seemed at peace, satisfied that he'd accomplished what he set out to do. The album was finished. The videos were complete. The message was delivered. Now, all that remained was the final act. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Iman found David in the living room, standing by the window, looking out at the city lights. She came up behind him and wrapped her arms around him. They stood like that in silence for a long time. Finally, Bowie spoke. "It's done," he said quietly. "Everything I needed to say, I've said. Everything I needed to create, I've created. I kept my promise to Dr. Chen. I finished my masterpiece as David Jones, not as Bowie, as myself." Iman tightened her arms around him. She could feel how thin he'd become, how fragile. "What happens now?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "Now," Bowie said, "I get to rest. Finally." 2 days later, on the morning of January 10th, 2016, David Robert Jones passed away at his home in Manhattan, surrounded by his family. He died as himself. The masks finally set aside. The performances over. The boy from Brixton, who had spent 50 years becoming everyone except himself, had, in the end, come home. The news broke a few hours later, and the world collectively gasped. Social media exploded. News outlets scrambled to cover the story. Fans gathered outside his New York home, leaving flowers and candles and tears. But what shocked everyone most was the sudden, devastating realization of what Black Star actually was. Within hours, people were revisiting the album, the videos, the lyrics, and understanding with horrible clarity that they'd been listening to a man's carefully orchestrated farewell. The Lazarus video, released just days before his death, became almost unwatchable in its transparency. The hospital bed, the bandaged eyes, the line, "Look up here, I'm in heaven." The final image of Bowie backing into the wardrobe and closing the door. It was all there. He had told everyone exactly what was happening, hidden in plain sight behind the language of art and symbol. Tony Visconti broke his silence 3 days after Bowie's death, posting on social media. "He made Black Star for us, his parting gift. His death was no different from his life, a work of art." That statement unlocked the flood of revelations about what the previous 2 years had really been. The secret diagnosis, the race to finish the album, the determination to die on his own terms, with his final artistic statement complete. In the months and years following Bowie's death, more details emerged about those final 2 years. Dr. Chen, after receiving permission from the estate, spoke publicly about that extraordinary morning in January 2014 when Bowie smiled at his death sentence. "He taught me something profound that day," Chen said in a 2018 interview. "He showed me that how we die is just as important as how we live. Maybe more important. He turned his death into art, into meaning, into a gift for the world. I've delivered hundreds of terminal diagnoses since then, and I always remember David's response. It changed how I think about mortality." Iman rarely spoke publicly about those final years, but in a 2019 appearance, she offered a glimpse into what it was like living with a man who was dying but refused to be defeated by death. "He was working until nearly the end," she said. "Not because he was in denial, but because he had a mission. He wanted to show people that even death can be faced with creativity, with courage, with artistry. He wanted his last act to matter." And it did. The album Black Star has taken on a significance that goes beyond music. It's studied in death and dying courses at universities. It's analyzed by philosophers and theologians. It's held up as an example of how art can help us process mortality. The opening track, with its strange, unsettling beauty, has become almost a secular requiem, played at funerals and memorials around the world. Bowie created exactly what he told Dr. Chen he would create. A masterpiece made not as a character, but as himself, confronting the ultimate transformation. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Black Star is how it recontextualizes Bowie's entire career. Looking back through the lens of his final work, all those personas, all those transformations, all those characters take on new meaning. They weren't just artistic choices. They were a man running from himself, from the ordinary boy from Brixton who was terrified he wasn't enough. Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane, the Thin White Duke. They were all elaborate shields, glittering armor protecting a vulnerable core that Bowie wasn't ready to expose. But in the end, when time ran out and death became not an abstract concept, but a concrete deadline, David Robert Jones finally had the courage to stand unmasked. And what the world discovered was that the real man was more compelling, more moving, more human than any of the characters had ever been. Dr. Richard Chen retired from medicine in 2020. In his final week at New York Presbyterian Hospital, he did something he'd never done before. He framed a quote and hung it in his office for the next generation of doctors to see. It was something Bowie said as he was leaving that January morning in 2014, a moment Chen had kept private for years but felt needed to be shared. As Bowie reached the "Doctor," he turned back to Chen and said, "Doctor, I want to thank you for not sugarcoating this. Some doctors try to soften death, make it sound less final than it is, but you were honest, and that honesty gave me clarity. You gave me permission to stop running and start creating. In a strange way, you gave me my life back, right at the moment you told me it was ending. That's a gift I can never repay." The quote hangs in that office still, a reminder that sometimes the worst news can paradoxically become a catalyst for the best work, the truest living, the most authentic version of ourselves. David Bowie proved that even in dying, we can choose how our story ends. We can choose to face the darkness with creativity and courage. We can choose to leave something beautiful behind. When Bowie smiled at his death sentence that January morning, he wasn't in denial. He wasn't delusional. He was accepting the ultimate creative challenge, to make his death mean something, to transform mortality itself into art. And in doing so, he gave the world one final gift, one final transformation, one final proof that David Bowie, even at the very end, could take the ordinary and make it extraordinary. The boy from Brixton who became a starman finally came home to earth. And in that descent, in that final transformation from icon back to human, he showed us all something profound about what it means to live fully, even when life is ending. Black Star remains his final statement, his closing argument, his proof that art can transcend even death. Every time someone discovers the album, learns the story behind it, and realizes what they're actually hearing, Bowie achieves a kind of immortality. Not as Ziggy, not as the Duke, but as David Robert Jones, the man who taught the world that dying with intention is the ultimate creative act. That's the legacy he chose. That's the gift he left. And that's why Dr. Chen's diagnosis, which could have been the end of everything, became instead the beginning of Bowie's greatest masterpiece, the transformation of death into transcendent art.